is entitled Just a Translator, and it's I'm going to talk, as Davina said, about different professions that are available to those of us that study language and your students that study language. But I have to admit to a certain bias, because I have spent most of my working career in audiovisual translation, and there was a sort of consensus that you might be interested in the audiovisual translation side. So that's mostly what I'm going to be talking about today. Okay, my slides. Got it. Okay, so I'm going to talk about careers in audiovisual translation, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what people need to do to get work, so training and work. And then I'm also going to touch a bit on machine translation and what the implications are of that for careers in translation, and hopefully also leave a bit of time at the end for questions and answers. So we're going to start off with a poll, please, as I want to know about your preferences. So poll number 1, please. So I want to know about your media viewing preferences. Okay, I can't see any results yet, but maybe that's normal. Oh wow, that's a real, yes, that's an overwhelming majority for subtitles. So probably not unpredictable, given that we're all linguists. We all want to hear the original, or not everybody, but most people want to hear the original audio, and some people choose dubbed, and nobody only watches media in their mother tongue, which is nice. Thank you. So I'm going to start by talking about subtitling, and that's the preference for most of the audience. Then I'm going to talk a bit about dubbing and voiceover. So those are the sort of the major components of careers in audiovisual translation. That's the kind of the way that the industry breaks down. And I don't know if anybody, do we have a hands up function? No, I don't think we do. I wonder if anybody is aware of the phenomenon of lecturing or Gavrilov translation. I think Kevin might be, because I know that at the moment he's in Poland. So lecturing or Gavrilov translation is a sort of interesting, different form of audio-visual translation, which consists of a sort of interpreter type mediation. And usually one or two actors, or sort of, they're not really actors, they're kind of more like newsreaders, interpret the source text over the top of the program. So you don't get any acting, you get a kind of very monotone translation of what's being said. So you can look that up and have a look. So that's a bit of a curio, but not to the people who use it. It's, you know, very popular in some territories, but mostly those are the sorts of types of audio-visual translation that are used for translating foreign media. But part of audio-visual translation as well is what we call accessibility. And I'm sure you're aware of the different types of accessibility, but just to list them. So we have subtitling for the deaf and hard of hearing. It's also called SDH. And that can be same language or translation subtitling, and it's also called closed captioning, and that also falls under the umbrella of audiovisual translation, both in practice and as a research topic. Audio description for the blind and partially sighted, also called AD, and as I say, that also falls under audiovisual translation, and I'm doing some research actually at the moment in audiovisual translation, audio description in heritage settings, in museums and heritage gardens. So it's really interesting that in audiovisual translation, we have this sort of mediation, which doesn't involve moving from one language to another. And it's not to do with the screen, but it still sits in audiovisual translation in both practice and theory. And then just to complete the suite of what we mean when we talk about audiovisual translation, there is also sign language interpreting that also sits with with accessibility, which then in turn sits with audiovisual translation as a discipline. So here is a dubbing studio. So this is somewhere where you might want to work if you became a dubbing translator. It's a very grand dubbing studio, as you can see, and actually this sort of studio is really common in France. You do get them here as well, but not as often. In France, there's a tradition of dubbing taking place with all the actors or all the actors that are in a scene in the same room. Whereas in other countries, and certainly in the UK, it's more common for the actors to record separately and to record in quite small rooms. But it doesn't look as good. This is a really nice kind of grand dubbing studio with a huge mixing desk, but they're not all like this. But I like to show this picture to my students because it sort of gives them ambition to want to go and work in a room like this. There's a really nice clip that I showed to them actually, which you can look up if you're interested in seeing somebody dubbing in action. And what it is, it's the beginning of Mrs. Doubtfire. So I don't know if you remember or if you've seen the film, but at the beginning of Mrs. Doubtfire, Robin Williams, the main character, is working as a dubbing actor. So he's dubbing animated cartoons. So the beginning of the film starts with him dubbing this animated cartoon in the studio with his long-suffering editor. So have a look at that. You can it's freely available on YouTube. So we go from this grand dubbing studio to a back street in Walford, and this is subtitling for the deaf and hard of hearing. So this is also something that an audiovisual translator would produce, and you'll notice that in contrast to the first slide that I showed of subtitling, which had white text, because that was interlingual subtitling, so translation subtitling. This is blue and green, and the reason that it's blue and green, for those of you that don't know, is because in some types of accessibility subtitling, so subtitling for the deaf and hard of hearing, we use colours to indicate speakers. So there are two ways of indicating speakers. One is by actually just writing the name of the speaker, or man or woman. You'll have seen that as well. But the other way that's used on the BBC is to use colours. And there are only 4 colours that are used in speaker identification, and they just cycle round the 4 colours, starting always in the same order. And I'm reliably informed that if you use subtitles for deaf and hard of hearing, it's quite easy to work out who's talking by the colour. But although I find it really difficult, but I think it must be something that if you practice, you get better at. And also this. So this is opera. So another type of audiovisual translation is what's called surtitles. And I'm sure you talented linguists in the audience can work out why they're called surtitles. Anyone that's done Latin. So they're projected above the action on the stage, although these days they're often also projected in a screen in the seat in front of you or on your iPhone. But traditionally they are projected above the stage and are therefore called surtitles. But those are also they're also created and processed by an audiovisual translator. So that's something else that you can do with translation. And this one, I find this particularly interesting, actually. This is a new thing, and it was just sort of finalised just before we all had to stop going to the theatre. But the National Theatre are pioneering what they're calling smart caption glasses, and they sit on top of your ordinary glasses, as in the gentleman in the picture, or not if you don't wear glasses, and they provide captions for theatre performances. So they not only enable people who are deaf and hard of hearing to go to the theatre with their hearing family and friends, but they're also a route to translation, so that you can go to the theatre and watch a play in a language that you don't necessarily speak or don't speak so well. So it's a bit like having subtitled theatre. So this is another sort of exciting development that also sits within audiovisual translation, and I was involved in this to a very, very small extent. So I find it very exciting and thrilling that people are constantly working on improving access. Next poll, please. So feel free to pick as many as apply for this one. Okay, good. Oh, that's great. That's wonderful. So yes, we've got total newbies and lots of people who are interested in doing it. Good, because it's quite difficult to know, because sometimes people have done what's called fan subbing, which is the voluntary subtitling of usually films and TV series that's organised in communities online. That's a whole other webinar all by itself. So what can we do if we work in audiovisual translation? What jobs are there for the keen linguist? Well, most people that do subtitling are freelance. So you can be a freelance subtitler, you could be a translation subtitler or an accessibility subtitler, and some people do both, in fact. There are some jobs for subtitlers working in-house, although not that many, and fewer as the time goes on. And actually, most people that work in-house in subtitling don't really do subtitling. They tend to do quality control. So a lot of my students end up working in-house in subtitling and dubbing companies. And they choose that because they want the financial security, but they're not really subtitling. They're working with subtitles, but they're not actually subtitling. You can be a dubbing translator or a dubbing adapter, and some territories you can do both at once. Some of them, in some territories, that job is rolled into one job. So in dubbing, we translate, then we write dialogue with our translation, and then we adapt that translation for lip sync and other types of synchronization. And that's a whole other webinar in itself as well. I mean, just to give you an idea, the audiovisual translation module at the University of Westminster is 22 hours of contact time, and a lot of self-study. And we only really scratch the surface. So it's an enormous field with lots of really interesting things to learn. So dubbing translators and adapters are sometimes freelance, and they are sometimes employed by studios, not in this country generally. Studios, in fact, not at all in this country, because dubbing's just not very big in this country, but it's getting bigger. Because you will be aware that people like Netflix and Amazon are buying and even making much more non-English content, which can only be a good thing. And the appetite for non-English content is really growing. I did my PhD, finished my PhD in 2016, and at that point, it was really quite a small amount of people that watched non-English content, but more than sort of 10 years previously. But in those intervening 5 years, it's really skyrocketed, so which is great. You could be a dubbing director. That's quite a high-profile, prestigious job. So directing, making sure that all the actors do the right thing and are synchronized and are acting correctly and are matching the source text and producing. I mean, it's that you want to be producing a piece of media that's as close to being as good as the original as it can be. Which is, it's a really inspiring, I mean, I've not been a dubbing director, but I've been a language director. It's a really inspiring kind of cause, because you want to make this media available to people who don't speak the original language, and you want to make it as good as you can. There's lots of jobs for project managers, and often my students come and they say, yeah, but I'm a translator, why would I want to manage projects? But for some people, it's okay. It's enough to be around the language and around the process of subtitling and dubbing. And I did that job for many years, and it can be very fulfilling. You need to have a lot of linguistic insight to be able to manage subtitling and dubbing projects, because you need to appreciate some of the issues, or all of the issues that arise when you're dealing with multiple languages. So that also has its own challenge. You could be a vendor manager. That's a bit more of a generic job, but we do need them in audiovisual translation, in fact, in all types of translation, because so many of the workforce are freelance. And again, it really helps if people are aware of the issues around translation. So the vendor manager manages the group of freelance talent, And that can be actors, and it can be dubbing directors, but it is also freelance subtitlers, freelance translators, freelance dubbing translators, dubbing adapters, and books them and sorts out their money. It's one of those jobs for somebody that likes to be busy with lots of different things. Of course, subtitling and dubbing companies also need salespeople, something else that I've also done in my long career, in the same way as anybody else. And again, it's really helpful if you know what you're selling. So language service providers, as they're often called, subtitling and dubbing companies, tend to employ linguists in all jobs. They tend to be run by linguists. They tend to have been started off by somebody who was a translator or a subtitler and just kind of wanted to be a bit more entrepreneurial than running their own sole trader business. And they tend to be staffed by linguists in most roles, because it is such a specialist sort of skill set and knowledge set, that it's important that you know what's going on. You could be a localization engineer. This is a really interesting one, actually. I thought you might like this because it might be something that appeals to some of the students that you teach. Localization engineers have to have a very broad range of both linguistic and technical skills. So, and I mean, by technical skills, I mean to do with computing and to do with localization, the actual coding. So they're employed by games companies, software companies, anyone that is doing localization, translation within an IT environment. So they need to have the language, but also the IT sort of. And when I say IT, I don't mean using software packages. I mean actually understanding about coding and about writing software packages. So it's a really nice kind of hybrid job for somebody who's good at sciences and languages. You can be a games tester. I think I talk about this a bit later on as well. So there's lots of audiovisual translation also takes place in computer games. So most computer games will be localized in other languages, certainly the successful ones, and they need subtitles, they need voiceover, they need dubbing, and they need testing. Games testing is one of those jobs that the students really like. It's not paid very well, but you're paid to play computer games. So it's quite a nice job for sort of part-time, alongside studying, or when you're young, when you're a young adult, because all games that are translated need somebody to check that they work, that the translations are correct, that the translations mean what they are supposed to mean, and that they lead the player through the right twists and turns if it's that kind of game. And the gaming community are very vocal. So the games companies are arguably more concerned about translation quality than some other clients of audiovisual translation might be, because they're really worried about what their fans might say. And you may well have heard that there have been some very high profile failures of game localization across the years that have sort of gone viral and become sort of laughing stocks. So games companies are very keen to avoid that. Some people do combinations of those, and there are of course other jobs as well. So the audiovisual translation industry, as I said, is primarily staffed by freelance workers, and lots of people do a combination of jobs, or even as an in-house job. You may find a sort of a small company who might well employ somebody as a project manager, but have them also do subtitle QC, or even subtitle in their language combination, because they need somebody in-house, or they have the job allows them to have time to do that. So how do we get work in those professions? The sort of established route is to do an internship, and we can talk about internships at great length, and whether they're exploitative and how desirable they are. But this is the way of the industry at the moment, is that most internships are unpaid. But it is a good way of getting experience, and I recognise that it's not equal, because not everybody can afford to do an internship. It's necessary to have a degree. I'm just going to warn you in advance that I'm going to contradict myself on the next slide. But it's preferable to have an MA. And there are MAs. So my MA has a module in audiovisual translation. There are actually pure MAs in audiovisual translation. I think I've got that on a slide later on. But you don't necessarily need to have to do one that's focused. You can get work and you can work without an MA, but it's more difficult. So as I don't know why the slide came up in a funny order, but I'm sure it's my fault. So internships in subtitling companies, internships in dubbing studios. There are shorter courses. So if any of you are genuinely interested in branching out a bit, there are online courses, there are one-day courses, there are sort of 3-week courses. So there's kind of all sorts of different, from taster right through to full-on full-time master's courses in audiovisual translation that you can undertake, or in parts of audio. So you can just do a course in audio description, for example, or one in subtitling, or one in dubbing, one in voiceover. And subtitling services are everywhere at the moment. Subtitling is big, subtitling is common. Most translation companies will now, big ones, will offer subtitling, and some are of higher quality and experience than others. There is a sort of slight approach in certain parts of the sector that thinks that subtitling is just translation chopped up into bits, and it's not. It's really not. But what that does mean is that it's quite. It's easier than it used to be anyway. I mean, I've been in subtitling since the last century, and it's easier than it used to be to get work, for definite. And it's also easier now. We use what's called the template method. So very briefly, I'm aware of time, the template method is where an English subtitle file is created of an English piece of media, usually some kind of a Hollywood piece of media, and then that English template is sent to translators to translate. So rather than having to do the timing for the subtitling for the subtitles all themselves, the translators only have to do the translation. They still have to abide by all the subtitling specific rules for translation, but they don't have to learn how to time. So again, it's easier to get work now the template method is used. And apparently there's a lack of subtitlers into English. So if you have, I'm sure not everybody in your classrooms is English native, but I'm guessing that you probably have a fairly large proportion. And if they are interested in working in audiovisual translation, I'm told that, well, I mean, I guess it makes sense because there's a lack of linguists, Anglophone linguists, that there's a lack of subtitlers into English, and there's a need for subtitlers into English. Timings. So translation subtitling is quite laborious. So just for comparison, a text translator will do between 2,000 and 2,500 words a day. A translation subtitler can only do 30 minutes of runtime film a day, and it will depend on quality. So unfortunately, it's not very well paid. Which causes me great sadness, but it's one of the reasons why I'm no longer a subtitler and now I'm an academic. So as an academic, I'm paid a lot more than I would be paid if I was a freelancer, or than I was paid when I was a subtitler. SDH subtitling for the deaf and hard of hearing, so no translation, 40 to 45 minutes a day, again, depending on the quality that's necessary. Subtitling doesn't cost very much to buy, and therefore there isn't very much left over to pay the subtitler, sadly. So what often happens is that people do subtitling alongside other forms of translation. Thinking about training. So as I said, BA degrees do exist in translation, not in audiovisual translation, but only in translation, and they're quite rare. As I said, there are MA degrees in translation interpreting. There is the diploma in translation, which is run by the Chartered Institute of Linguists. That's very much text-based, but it's a good start. as I said, there are audiovisual translation specific courses. And now here's a bit where I'm going to contradict myself. In theory, there is no need for any qualification because translation is unregulated in the UK. So you don't need to have any kind of piece of paper to prove that you can work as a translator. And that's quite an issue for those of us that do have qualifications and are trained, because it does mean that alongside, well, it's part of a contributing factor to what I was just talking about before about the pay levels of subtitlers. Because if somebody comes along and who is not trained and experienced and can turn out bad quality subtitles quickly, they can charge less. And that unfortunately is quite a common scenario. And there's various movements to try and improve that, and it slowly is improving, but yeah, it is quite slow. So yes, you need a qualification. However, no one's going to stop you if you send out your CV and say that you're a subtitler without any qualifications. So subtitling, big pros, it's a really super job. I really enjoyed it when I did it. I still do the odd bit now, and I find it really creatively fulfilling. It's very creative, it's interesting, it's challenging, it combines technical skills with linguistic skills. It's a nice combination of technical awareness and creativity. I worked, probably the highest profile title that I actually did linguistic work on was Der Untergang. I didn't do the subtitles myself, but I did the quality control of the subtitles, which was quite an honor. As part of my work in subtitling companies, I've worked on all sorts of things, from Game of Thrones to Harry Potter to Star Wars. The cons are it can be hard to break into, although that's getting a lot better now. As I said, it's quite badly paid. There are always tight deadlines, as you can imagine, because you know, people in the rest of the world want to see Game of Thrones at the same time as people in the Anglophone world, and why shouldn't they? And piracy is a big issue. And although people always think that subtitling, certainly my students always think that subtitling is Hollywood films and Game of Thrones and you know, whatever huge titles, there's quite a lot of subtitling work that is not creative, and we've got some cleaning materials on the slide, because one of the things that I did was a dishwasher manual video, so how to service your dishwasher. And I used to do a big job every week, which took a whole day of my week, for a well-known car manufacturer who had subtitled news programs running in their car plants, and because the car plants are very noisy, they have to have subtitles. So that was my Tuesday. Tuesday was a car manufacturer news day, and I spent all day subtitling a video of car news. Pretty much my low point was a 46-minute video for a well-known burger chain about how to make their signature burger. So you can deduce from that it takes 46 minutes to train somebody to make the signature burger for a well-known burger chain. And I can tell you that a lot of that, and this is pre the pandemic, a lot of the 46 minutes is hand washing. So you can be sort of reassured about that. As a quick aside, subtitling and dubbing tasks have been shown to be really useful in the modern languages classroom. And I'm sorry if I'm teaching you to suck eggs and you already knew that, but subtitling and dubbing tasks, there's been quite a lot of research to show that subtitling and dubbing tasks are really helpful in language learning. So if you're not aware of that, it might be an idea to have a look. It's something different to do with students, not telling you how to do your jobs, of course. So the audiovisual translation market is booming, but as I said, it is not lucrative. And this cartoon is obviously not AVT specific, but it sort of points up a problem in the translation market. Just a quick note on games localization. I've touched on it earlier on. So as part of games, most games, as I said, use subtitling, they use voiceover and dubbing. There's also what they call the box and docs. So the box and all the game documentation and the actual cartridge documentation. I don't suppose people buy cartridges anymore, but the documentation that goes with the game about how to use it and all the kind of legal stuff, that all has to be translated. And then there's testing and quality control as well for games. So I'm going to use the last sort of 10-15 minutes to talk about machine translation. Again, I've got a bit of a cartoon. I'm not sure if you can read it, but yeah, it's a sort of musing on the vagaries of using machine translation. So machine translation started in the 1950s and was sort of full of great promise, really. People thought that within 20 years there would be a translation engine that would rival the human, and then they quickly realized that actually that wasn't going to happen. We started off teaching computers to translate in the same ways we teach humans, which I think is quite, I mean, it's quite understandable, but also quite interesting because it didn't work. So we taught them grammar and we taught them vocabulary. So we taught them rules and we fed them with lots of dictionaries, basically, and they weren't very good. So it only really worked for very, very limited subsets of language, so very controlled language. And the one system that I know of that's still in use, so I think there's more than one, but the one that I know of is the one that translates weather reports for the Canadian government. Because you can imagine that weather reports have a very limited amount of vocabulary. So that works quite well. And weather reports don't have very complicated grammar. And if they're slightly wrong, it doesn't really matter. I mean, you know, in terms of the grammar, obviously, if the content's wrong, it does matter. There was a big step forward in the 1990s, which is when machine translation kind of became, people in the general populace became aware of machine translation. And that was the leap forward into statistical machine translation, which is effectively pattern matching. So then people realized that, you know, having taught the machine rules, it didn't work because languages don't stick to rules. You know, we know that we're working in English. It's a terrible language for not sticking to rules. So then people realized it also coincided with computing power becoming cheaper because you need a lot of computing power to process lots of data. So the more data you give the computer and you say, this is what I want it to look like, make it like this, and you give it loads and loads and loads, and it recognizes the patterns, and then it spits out the translation, and that works quite well. And then in 2015 or so, there was another kind of step change, and the introduction of neural machine translation, which is a sort of combination of statistical and using neural networks. So applying neural network technology to the pattern matching statistical machine translation that had gone previously. And that's really quite effective, but still has quite a lot of issues, as we will see. A poll, please. How do we feel about machine translation? I think you're only allowed to pick one. Interesting. That's a really interesting breakdown of answers. So no one's using it regularly. 20% of people are suspicious of it. 60% of people think it has its place, and 20% of people think they don't know enough about it. Interesting. I mean, I think my answer would probably be it has its place. Thank you. So in my experience of machine translation systems, and I have done quite a lot of research, although it's not something that I'm doing at the moment, but this is so machine translation systems, they do have their place. They work quite well, as I said in the Canadian example, with restricted language. They work quite well in closely related language pairs. So I was involved in a very big European project looking at machine translation of subtitles, and we did it in 9 language pairs, and one of them was Serbian and Slovenian. And although we didn't have a lot of data for Serbian and Slovenian, because they're so closely related, the results were really quite good. But the other thing you need for machine translation is you need large amounts of training material, and it needs to be the same type of material. So if you train your engines with legal translation, they're not going to produce good subtitles. If you train your engines with technical manuals, then you can't expect them to be able to do anything creative. So that's a sort of prerequisite. And I was at an event yesterday where somebody was commenting on the fact that Google Translate has an enormous amount of data to pull on, but it's very noisy. It's really not very good data. A lot of it is total rubbish. Whereas somebody who's building their own machine translation system can be very picky and very careful about the data that they use to train the system, and can therefore produce, with less data, can produce cleaner machine translation within a certain domain, within a certain language domain. Where it doesn't work very well is, for some reason, and nobody really knows why, because a lot of what happens in neural machine translation is a black box, and the scientists don't really know why things are happening. It tends to miss things out and not highlight that in any way. It can't, there is no indication from the system that it's missed something out. So it can miss out clauses, it can miss out words, and you can imagine that if it missed out the word not, this could be a really serious omission, or maybe the word million. So instead of 1 million, it was one. So that's a real showstopper weakness, I think. This will not come as a surprise that machine translation systems are not good at translating very figurative language. So they're not very good at novels. They're not very good. They're not brilliant at subtitles. It depends on what you give them. You can imagine something like EastEnders. It's quite repetitive. So you could give a machine translation system EastEnders, and it would come up with something that you could then edit to use to be useful. If you're going to give it Macbeth, it's really not, well, clearly it's not going to do very well. That would be very unfair, because human translators can't really do that either. But if you even, I don't know, you're going to give it the Booker Prize winner. Oh, that was a really bad example as well for this year, but never mind, you get the point. And the other thing that, although it's improving, it's still not that great, is that obviously a computer's not sentient. It's just recognizing patterns and processing language. So humans are constantly using other cues to assist understanding. And a computer, we can train a computer to do that to a certain extent, but it can still only take cues from sort of, say, for example, the page before and the page after. It can't take cues from 10 pages ago. There is no way to program the machine translation engine to do that. So it will really miss things that a human, even a child, would find very obvious. So using context to translate. And the example that I used to use for this was how in English we have an animal called a turkey, and we have a country that we call Turkey, whereas in other languages they have two words for that. That problem is now solved, and a good machine translation system could actually tell the difference. But the other example that I use is, if you answer the phone in Italian or in Italy, you say pronto. If you say hello to someone in the street, you're more likely to say something like ciao, whereas in English, we say hello for both. The computer can't do that. The computer can't tell the difference between those two scenarios. So it's still a long way to go yet. Just a quick note, I'm sure you know this, but free online systems are not safe, and they take your data. So it's not something that you can put anything, you can't put anything in there that doesn't belong to you, that or anything that requires to be kept confidential. So the current picture is that machine translation tends to be used in certain limited scenarios. So it's used a lot where any translation is better than none. So for example, in crisis situations, especially between lesser known languages where there aren't human translators, or there aren't enough, or they're not available, in things like user help forums, people asking questions about something that they've bought, or I know that there's certainly quite a lot of Wikipedia. Some of it's done with machines, some of it's done with humans. Something I've seen recently, which I think is quite a good step forward, is companies actually being open and transparent about when they're using machine translation, so that when you're looking at it, you can say, okay, I know this was translated by a machine, and I can adjust my expectations accordingly. Machine translation is also used for repetitive texts with little creative output or little or no creative output. So things like user manuals that run to hundreds and hundreds of pages, that may have sort of regular updates. Machine translation can be used for that. It can be used, as I said, in language pairs with rich and plentiful data. It's wonderful if you're in a hurry, because it is always going to be quicker than a human translator. So it's really, it's a great asset if you are in a hurry. But it is increasingly used with post-editing, so with human post-editing, and also human pre-editing sometimes in various settings. And it's because everybody's always looking for ways to save costs. It is increasingly being adopted in the translation profession. Careers. You can, again, this is a really lovely job for somebody who is both technical and is interested in language. So the people that develop machine translation systems are called computational linguists, and there's always a need for people with that skill set, because people with that sort of broad across disciplines career path are quite rare. So computational linguists, if you've got students who are sort of a science bent but are doing a language as well, which was what happened to me. I did maths and German. That's a really nice career for them. That's my alternative career, I think, if I have my time again. And then on the linguistic side, there is increasingly a need for post-editors, so people who work with machine translation output. And this is a really interesting one for me, because people who are trained as, or a lot of people who are trained as translators find the idea of working as a post-editor quite problematic, and they say, but that's not what I want to do, and it's not what I signed up to do, and I want to translate. But there's a certain type of person who actually finds that editing task quite satisfying, and I find it quite satisfying. I quite like editing. So I think it's something to consider, not to sort of reject out of hand, that there is a certain type of person who likes to amend things rather than create them from scratch. And there's definitely a challenge in post-editing, because the kinds of mistakes that the machine translation system makes are not the same as the sorts of mistakes that a human makes. So it's a whole new sort of learning field, if you're interested in that sort of thing. Just to wrap up, to sort of tie the two parts of my presentation together, most translators will work with some kind of technology. It's gone are the days. My boss's father, who dictated his translations into a dictaphone and gave them to his secretary. That's not. I mean, he would have been in his 90s now, and was a well-respected translator. I mean, all careers, or most careers, have some kind of an interface with technology, but certainly in translation, it's a sort of at a higher level for a lot of people. So most translators, not audiovisual translators, bizarrely, but most translators outside of audiovisual translation will work with computer-assisted translation tools. So that's not machine translation. That's a tool that stores your translations and then checks for matching and suggests them back to you. And it very much improves productivity. Especially now, we have a lot of remote interpreting, and it was a feature of the interpreting landscape before the pandemic, and of course now it very much is, and it will continue to be. So interpreters will be working with remote interpreting. As I said, machine translation with human in the loop, at some point pre-editing, post-editing, is going to grow. It's already here doing a lot, in lots of scenarios, it's going to grow. If you work in subtitling or dubbing, they are both quite technologically complicated professions. Subtitling especially. Subtitling has its own software, it has its own techniques, it has its own rules. It's a whole different set of skills to learn. And post-edited machine translation output, as I say, will be something, or is something, that translators quite frequently work with. So here is a screenshot, as I was just talking about the computer-assisted translations, so the sort of translation memory tool. Here's a screenshot of one of the main translation memory tools, and you can see that in the, I don't know if I got this, I have got a pointer. This side is your source text. Here is the text that's being translated, and here is the target text. And up here, you'll see this is where the translation memory software is suggesting translations that are in your library, in your memory, that you have produced before. So it's suggesting back to you the translations that, and most translators work with a tool that is similar to this. So definitely technology is here to stay. And that is everything I have to say. Does anyone have any questions? I think we've got about 8 minutes.